the core of a progressive political economy, and more generally of a progressive program altogether, is a combination of three structural themes. And each of them has to do with a relation between two elements. So first, the relation of the backward to the advanced parts of production. That was the subject today of the creation of a knowledge economy for the many, which we again discussed last week. The second is the relation of labor to capital. And the third is the relation of finance to the real economy or to the production system. These three subjects together are what I believe form the core of a progressive political economy and more generally of a progressive program. They then have to be combined with the other subjects of our discussion, which are, first, the creation of a high-energy democracy. Second, the alteration of the basis of social solidarity or cohesion, and the self-organization of civil society outside the market and outside the state. And third, the reorientation of the character of education as the kernel of an idea of the haven of capabilities and safeguards in which the agent, the individual, should be secured as all around him there rages a storm of innovation, change, and conflict. Now then, the theme of labor and capital. A theme which must always be of the utmost concern to the progressives. And here, as in all chapters of the programmatic discussion, we must distinguish the immediate problem from the long-range direction. The immediate problem today is focused on the abandonment of an increasing part of the labor force in all the major economies of the world to radical economic insecurity, often under the label preferred by neoliberalism of flexibility. Now, in the late 20th century, the orthodox approach to the organization and defense of labor was the perfection of the collective bargaining system, understood as a form of countervailing power, that is, power balancing the power of the employers. In the labor relation, in the employment relation, there is a radical inequality of power, of bargaining power between the two elements. And the idea is that this radical inequality, having some of the characteristics of what the jurists call economic duress, eviscerates the reality of contract, reducing contract in the employment context to a sham. And the aim of the collective bargaining system was to reestablish the reality of contract, by allowing the workers collectively organized through their unions to be a true counterweight to the power of the employers. Now let me step back for a moment and say the following. Today there are two main discourses about labor in the world. There is one discourse of the union leaders themselves, the leaders of the trade union movement, and the leaders of the left parties, that defends this collective bargaining system as the necessary and adequate antidote to the insecurity in which labor is placed. The problem is that this official discourse, while serving the interests of the organized minority, does not serve the interests of the disorganized majority of the labor force. In all the major economies of the world today, the percentage of the labor force that is unionized is quite small. In the United States, for example, it's something like 11 or 12% at most. And a large portion of those are employees of the state, public employees. The second discourse about labor is the neoliberal discourse, which under the label of flexibility, in fact promotes a radical economic insecurity. And the insecurity presents not just a problem of economic injustice, but a problem of constraint on economic growth. How can there be a sustained dynamic of rise in productivity, of socially inclusive productivity and innovation in an economy in which there is a downward tilt to the returns to labor, and more generally, a cheapening of the wage? There can be no sustained innovation in a slave economy. And more generally, there will be none in an economy in which there is a persistent downward tilt to the returns to labor. So these two discourses seem to be inadequate, and we have to go beyond them. We have to find a discourse that is also in the interest of the disorganized majority, not just of the organized minority of the labor force. However, in my view, such a program has to have at least two parts. In one part, it should address the situation of the organized minority, and in the other part, it should take on the problem of the disorganized majority. Now, what can we say about the collective bargaining system and the alternatives to it? In the 20th century, there were two main labor law regimes in the world. The contractualist regime, which is the collective bargaining system, and the corporatist regime. And let me describe the essential elements of each of them. So, the contractualist regime, which wants to reestablish the reality of contract in the setting of the very unequal bargaining power that characterizes the employment relation, is based on two principles. The first principle is that the decision to unionize is wholly voluntary. The union itself is a kind of collective contract among the workers. And the workers, in turn, negotiate freely with their employers. And the second principle is that this collective organization of the unions is entirely independent from the state. It's not controlled in any way or oriented, guided by the government. There was, however, and there remains today, a second labor law regime, and this is the corporatist regime. Historically, the corporatist labor law regime was inspired by fascism, and especially by Italian fascism, the Carta del Lavoro that Mussolini's regime elaborated already in the late 1920s. But it inspired a series of initiatives, especially in Latin America, among regimes that claimed to be in some way leftist. These were the regimes of Cardenas in Mexico, of Perón in Argentina, and of Vargas in Brazil. So what I'm calling the corporatist regime was not the original formulation of this system by Italian fascism, but its transformation in Latin America by these Latin American nationalists and left-leaning populists. The corporatist regime is based on two principles that are the opposite of the principles that animate the contractualist labor law system. The first is that everyone in the economy, in principle, is automatically unionized. Through a combination of sectoral and territorial representation. In other words, in each branch of production, there is a union, and then it's divided up into states or territories or regions. And so there's a pyramidal structure that parallels the structure of the state. If you have a job, you're automatically unionized. The second principle of the corporatist regime is that the union system as a whole is under the tutelage of the state. It is thus a form of what the contemporary political scientists call corporatism, the organization of civil society outside the state, under the control of the state, in the form of quasi-state organizations. So the unions become quasi-state organizations. They are under the guidance, characteristically, of a ministry of labor. Now, it may seem that all the natural reasons for preference would go to the contractualist regime. But the contractualist regime suffers from three defects. That the corporatist regime is, in a certain sense, free from. The first defect of the contractualist regime is that in a very unequal economy, as all the contemporary economies are, characterized by the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, the contractualist labor law regime tends to echo and amplify the underlying inequalities. So in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, characteristically, the workers have common interests with their employers. The total wage cost of the enterprise is a relatively small part of the business. And when I say that they have a common interest, I mean they have a common interest as against everyone else in the economy. So the result, or a characteristic result, of the collective bargaining system is to work against the solidarity of the labor movement and to sacrifice this unity or solidarity to the narrow interests of particular parts of the labor force. The second defect of the contractualist regime is that it tends to give predominant influence to the merely economic, the short-term economic demands of the workers, what you could call economism. Their wages, their benefits. After all, the unions are voluntary organizations, and they maintain the loyalty of their members by advancing their short-term, their immediate material interests. And the third defect of the contractualist regime is that it therefore tends to suppress any larger institutional project of the labor movement. Any interest that it might have in the transformation of the economic order as a whole, as opposed to the promotion of the immediate material interests of the union members. But the corporatist regime, as it was established under the inspiration of European fascism, has the obvious defect of casting the unions into a subordinate role vis-a-vis the state. That's the significance of corporatism. Controlled mass mobilization. Mass mobilization under the control or under the guidance of the state. So what, in principle, would be the solution to this conundrum presented by the coexistence of these two labor law regimes with respect to the organized part of the labor force? The solution might be to combine the corporatist principle that everyone is automatically unionized with the contractualist principle of the complete freedom of the unions from the state, and thus to create a hybrid regime, a regime that would in some way mix the generative principles of these two labor law regimes. And in some countries, like Brazil, there is at least the beginning of such a hybrid labor law regime, although under the cloud of a great deal of conceptual confusion, of legal confusion about the character of such a hybrid. Now, it seems to me that this suggestion that I'm making is very unlikely to be practical because the labor movement, where it exists, is already a minority, a small minority of the labor force. It's already swamped by this problem of the disorganized majority. And its leaders are already overwhelmingly preoccupied with the defense of the short-term material interests of their members. So it seems unlikely that this alternative that I have just described and defended would in fact come to life as a major element in the world debate about labor. But I wanted to state this position as what would seem to me to be in principle preferable with respect to this organized minority of the labor force. Now, before going any further, let me stop and ask for your questions and comments. You see what the problem is and what the special characteristic of this hybrid regime is. Under the collective bargaining system, there has to be always an immense struggle to unionize. Under the corporatist regime, or the hybrid regime that I've described, the fact of unionization, of collective organization, is a gift of the law. So the whole focus of energy shifts from unionizing to deciding what to do with the power that the law gives you. In the actual corporatist regime, the one that was copied from fascist Italy, the significance of this gift of the law is somewhat eviscerated by the fact that the unions stand under the controlling influence of the state. But in the hybrid regime that I've described, the true value of this gift becomes apparent. Everyone is automatically unionized. So you could think then of the union structure as a structure that is independent of the state but parallel to the state. And different factions within the union movement can then compete for position in this unitary union structure, just as in a democracy, different political parties compete for position in the state. And these different factions in the union movement may or may not be affiliated to political parties. So this is in principle a very powerful solution. But it arrived on the historical stage late, when the practical opportunity for it had already largely passed because of the underlying change of the dominant practice of production. The basis of collective bargaining was industrial mass production. The assembly of a stable labor force in large productive units under the aegis of large businesses. That's what we think of as, in some sense, the natural form of the organization of labor. As I observed in an earlier class, that form of the organization of labor, in fact, had its heyday only from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. And it was preceded by a long historical period a period of several centuries in which production and labor were organized on the basis of a network of decentralized contractual arrangements. That's what Karl Marx describes as the putting out system in the early chapters of Das Kapital. And now labor begins to be once again organized on that basis on a global scale, on a kind of global putting out system. So these alternatives for the representation of organized labor are, in a sense, relevant to an economic reality that has already passed. Yes?
You say that one of the flaws of the contractual model is this kind of suppression of the interest of the broader economic order.
Yes.
For the sake of the immediate needs of the union members. How do you categorize something like the Fight for 15, which is the Fight for 15 and a union in that scheme? Like, is that
How is, say that again?
the Fight for 15?
I'm not hearing the words.
The Fight for 15 for the $15 minimum wage, that section of the labor movement, which is the Fight for 15 and a union in full. Where do you put that in the spectrum? Is that starting to break out of this law?
No, I think that the demand for a living wage or a national living wage would be an example of a general political theme. But I think that the main tendency of the union movement in these existing, of the contractualist movement in a segmented economy is to fragment. That's the main tendency. And a proof that that's the case is that the more ideological parts of the labor movement are characteristically the parts that are in public employment. It's the state. Because obviously if the state is the employer, then there's a there's a constraint, a counterweight to this fragmentation. Or else, for example, the graduate students in a university, because the university is like a state. But this is not representative of the way that the private economy is organized. So I think you could find many examples of ideologically motivated unions in these economies, but it doesn't seem to me to be the main tendency of what happens to the unions in a hierarchically segmented production system under the collective bargaining system. So it's a question of what the predominant tendency is. Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering if, on the road to realizing this hybrid model in practice, if that sort of presupposes labor that's already organized enough to demand it.
Well, let me say now, your question is very interesting because it provokes the following observation. Where there has been the beginning of a transition to this hybrid model, it has always been against the background of the corporatist regime. So in other words, if the corporatist regime in principle unionizes everyone, then it's relatively easy to introduce the principle, everyone's organized, now everyone should be independent of the state. But the reverse sequence is much harder to imagine, and in fact has not occurred anywhere. The reverse sequence is if you started with the principle of the automatic freedom of the unions from the state, and then you tried to add the idea of the automatic unionization of everyone. That seems to be a much more radical step and change, and very unlikely to occur. Just imagine it in the United States, suddenly introducing the principle that everyone will automatically be unionized. That would be shocking to the Americans, shocking ideologically and practically. even though in the abstract you could say it's no more shocking than the other change with respect to the corporatist system of making it truly independent from the state. Yes.
So I have a question about like the progression of the hybrid model, and this basically like, so if we start from the principle that everyone automatically either can be or is in a union, is the efforts of unionization themselves coordinated independently, or could they potentially be coordinated by the state or some institutional apparatus and then left alone?
Well, I'll give you the Brazilian example, because Brazil is the country where that comes closest now to this hybrid model that I just described. There is an independent labor judiciary. It's a separate part of the judiciary, and it organizes everything with regard to labor, including the elections. So the elections are not under the control of the state. The elections are under the control of the specialized judiciary. And then, so they're national elections, and there are, within the labor movement, there are confederations, which, in other words, movements that have a distinct ideological or political coloration, and that typically are associated with particular political parties. So the different parts of the labor movement nationally are competing for position in this unitary union structure. Just as I said, the political parties compete for position in the structure of the state. So it's literally like a parallel state outside the state. But the occasion for it is the organization of labor. Yes?
In Brazil, what's been the effect of the transition on people's participation in sharing unions? What kind of practical effects that have?
Well, I think the problem is that is the distinction between the legal pretense and the reality. So 50% of the Brazilian labor force is in the so-called informal economy, meaning that it's not in this structure. So these are all the people who are working in the illegal or shadow economy, beyond the protection of the law. And that means that they're not within the system at all. They weren't in the original corporatist system, and they aren't in the hybrid form. And now there's a second transformation, which is what I'm saying is this contrast that I described being overtaken by a change in the underlying practice of production. Because in the formal economy, an increasing part of the labor force is in circumstances of precarious, temporary employment, unstable employment, precarious employment. So if you add the 50% that's in the informal economy to the increasing part of the formal economy that is thrown into precarious jobs, unstable temporary employment, that sum is the decisive majority of the labor force. So the decisive majority of the labor force is outside of the hybrid regime, although officially the hybrid regime is supposed to include everyone. So that's what's happened in reality. So it becomes hard then to describe the consequences of the hybrid regime, given that its practical reality is being undermined by the combination of these two forces that I just described. That's the problem. So that's why I say that the solution that I've just described is a solution for a world which in some ways is ceasing to exist. And so this is an example of historical belatedness. The inspiration came too late. as it often does in history. Huh? So that's what you could say about it. And the main problem is then that there is this new reality that in a world in which the dominant form, the dominant arrow of production, the arrow of economic progress becomes the knowledge economy in an insular form, which is what we have. The insular knowledge economy is accompanied by a series of phenomena, one of which is the reduction of labor to precarious employment. In other words, there's this bifurcation, as I described, of the production process between the creative and profitable part and the routinized part. The routinized part is subcontracted, often to firms and workers, businesses in remote parts of the world, taking advantage of global tax and labor arbitrage, differences in wage and in the tax take. And inside the domestic economy, an increasing part of the labor force is abandoned to retrograde low-quality services, low-wage services, disorganized, either informal or precarious in the formal economy. That's the economic reality, which is undermining this system from below. So while we're having this debate about the two regimes for the organization and representation of labor, the underlying reality of production is changing. And that change in the underlying reality of production is overwhelming the significance of these labor law regimes. That's the problem. So that's why this discussion is a discussion about, as it were, a preliminary. Did you? Yes.
Do you think that, so under a knowledge economy for the many, we talked about how the relationship, well, really the nature of work changes a little bit.
Yes.
Hierarchies become less segmented, experimentation becomes more central. Do you think that in any way that type of reorganization within the actual workforce itself would be reflected in maybe the internal organization of union hierarchies? Or do you think that mostly like the conventional way of organizing a union would remain the same?
No, I don't think it could remain the same. And I think that's part of the discussion. Now, continuing the discussion, what comes next? So there's the immediate discussion of what to do about precarious, insecure labor. And then there's the long-term discussion of what happens with labor over the long term. So we have to have both those discussions. So on the question of the immediate, this is the problem, that we have to resist the impulse to imagine that by decree, by law, we can simply declare illegal and suppress the new relations of production. So this is the standard position of the leaders of labor and of the conventional left. The zero-hour contracts, the temporary contracts, the precarious employment is declared illegal. It's a fraudulent circumvention of the labor laws. And this is an attempt then to rule out by decree the new realities of production. I think it can't work. On the other hand, there's the neoliberal discourse. Throw down the walls, abolish the restraints, flexibility. Flexibility is a euphemism for radical economic insecurity. So it seems to me that both those positions are unacceptable. And the problem is, what's the alternative? That's the fundamental problem. And it's a problem that's absolutely crucial to the progressives, because After all, their whole historical base is the representation of labor in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. So that's what has to be rethought. So you would begin with the problem of precarious labor as it is being presented in the circumstance of the insular knowledge economy. So reducing it to a caricature, there's a vanguard. The vanguard is a fringe. In the fringe, there doesn't have to be a union because the employees and the employers have the same interests. You know, the employees of Microsoft, the technical employees, are also like little entrepreneurs. They have common interests with their employers against everyone else in the economy. That's the problem. What are we going to, and everyone else is consigned to some kind of make work and left disorganized and in a precarious situation and so forth. So you could begin by saying there should be a sliding scale. So the unstable employers, the ones who are outside this vanguard, should be organized and represented to the greatest extent possible. And we should use the new communication and information technologies to organize them and represent them. But to the extent that they are not organized and represented, we could say, there should be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. Now, what's an example of the content of this direct legal intervention in the employment relation? An example would be a principle of the price neutrality of labor. So you could say, for example, labor performed under conditions of temporary employment should be remunerated at a level comparable to the remuneration of the similar labor performed under conditions of stable employment. Because that would be a way, technically, of distinguishing legitimate flexibility from the illegitimate cheapening of labor. The cheapening of labor is prejudicial because it's, broadly speaking, incompatible with a dynamic of inclusive rise in productivity, what I describe as the upward tilt to the returns to labor. So how do you secure it? By this legal intervention in the employment relation. Now, yes?
Just a quick definitional question. Who sits at the vanguard from a firm or individual level, in your view, in the American context today?
What is the vanguard?
Which firms or which firms?
Yeah, so it's not just high-tech manufacture. It's the knowledge economy as I characterize it with those characteristics. Remember the characteristics. So it's at the level of production engineering or the technical division of labor. It's the combination of production at scale with customization or destandardization. And it's the combination of a great decentralization of initiative with the maintenance of cohesion and momentum in the process of production. I gave the military analogy. It's like a regular army that takes on some of the attributes of an irregular or guerrilla force without losing its coherence and hierarchy. And then there are the deeper characteristics that it inadequately manifests in its present insular form. So the heightening of the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust required, allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. The narrowing of the distance between the practice of discovering things and the practice of making things, and the loosening or even reversal of what has been the most constant constraint in economic life, the so-called law of declining marginal returns to an input in production. So I would say it's the combination of all of those attributes. Now, where is it manifest? It's not manifest solely in high technology manufacturing, and certainly not solely in the platform oligopolies. It's manifest in all of these fringes that exist in every part of the economy, intellectually dense services like software for a service, precision or scientific agriculture. The knowledge economy is multi-sectoral, but in each sector it exists as a fringe, excluding the vast majority of workers and firms. That's the basic idea. So the vanguard then has this exclusive and insular character. And everyone else is then abandoned to some form of make work. Now, one of the characteristics of this situation is that the distinction among sectors of production becomes much less clear. For example, the distinction between manufacture and services. High-tech manufacture, in a sense, consists in crystallized intellectual services and is sometimes, in fact, bereft of any physical apparatus. The businesses are so-called fabless. They have no factories. It's all intangible in intellectual property and in intellectual capabilities. And so the character, the relation of everyone else in the economy to these advanced instruments of production is undermined, and so that's the situation that I'm evoking. And the question, so we can imagine a series of emergency solutions, of emergency responses to that. But they are only the prefigurement of what would have to be a long-term project. What then is the long-term project? So the short term, I described a solution for the organized minority, it's the hybrid model. And then a solution for the disorganized majority, the sliding scale, organization and representation, or direct legal intervention in the employment relation. What about the longer term? So in the longer term, I would distinguish three elements, three aspects. So the first aspect has to do with the evolution of technology. So we are inclined to treat the evolution of technology as if it were an independent phenomenon with its own logic, rather than something that we create and we guide. So the long-term principle would be, over time, we prefer a form of technological evolution that enhances labor to a form of technological evolution that replaces labor. So some element of the evolution of technology is always going to replace labor. But the question is whether, as some technologies replace labor, do other technologies enhance labor? That's what we want. And that doesn't happen automatically. That happens because we guide the evolution of technology in a certain direction. And now, so let's go back then to the general idea of the machine and the relation between the machine and work. So I say, everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm, and we can then embody the formula or an algorithm in the physical contraption, the machine. The point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, and in a sense, our only resource, which is our time, for the not yet repeatable. And in principle, the ideal is that the worker conceived as the anti-machine should work with the machine. And the combination of the machine and the anti-machine will be much more powerful than either of them alone. So this is by contrast to what the machine has been in the history of production. In Adam Smith's pin factory, or in Henry Ford's assembly line, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines by repetitious movements that mimic the movements of his rigid machines, like the 6 kinds of metal cutting lathes. And now we want the worker to be the opposite of the machine. Now, of course, a complication is that the nature of the machines is always changing. So I just described the machine as embodying an algorithm or a formula. But we might come to think that there are certain advanced machines that no longer depend on formulas or algorithms. For example, the machines that allow us to do direct translation of natural languages. They go directly from big data to conclusions without an intermediate level of the formula or the algorithm. But what does the machine not do, ever? The machine lacks the quality of imagination. And what is the quality of imagination? It's that we distance ourselves from the phenomenon and then subsume it under a range of possible variations. And we understand something by understanding what it can become in this domain, in this penumbra of the adjacent possible. So our principle would be, no human being should be condemned to do work that can be done by a machine. What a machine can do, a human being should not do. And we should shape the evolution of technology so that over time and in general, although not in every instance, it enhances labor rather than replacing labor. That's the first principle that would guide the longer term relation between labor and capital. Yes?
I guess there's obviously, like, there are jobs, right, that probably nobody really wants to do, like being a trash person. Like, my grandfather was a trash person. It's like, I think it's real work, but I think if given the opportunity to do something different than that, you would eradicate that completely. And that seems like a thing that is repetitive, that is fairly, like, whatever, that is, like, probably on the cusp of being replaced. But it seems like your largest thesis is always that, like, if you were to make that more streamlined, make that whatever, that the people who are doing that job would find some other work that allowed them to be creative but was complementary to their skill
Yes, but that goes to an intermediate stage, right? So, for example, shelf stackers in drugstore chains or in supermarkets can work with machines, and the machine can improve their experience of labor. So it's not that the machine has to immediately replace the labor, but then there might be another stage in which it does. So we can imagine a process, but this is over time the general direction of the process. The general direction of the process is that the formulaic should be replaced by a collaboration between the formulaic and the non-formulaic. That's, I'm affirming as a principle what we would desire. But of course it may be hard to achieve in many particular instances.
I guess the question is just that, like, I guess why is the goal that we would take all of those workers and continue to have them work full careers, essentially, when we could just have less working? Like, I think one of from during your first or second lecture, you were like,
No, I understand. So this is this question now, going back to this debate with Marx and Keynes that I mentioned earlier, right? So remember, Marx and Keynes shared this idea. It's in Marx's Introduction to the Critique of the Gotha Program and Keynes' essay on economic possibilities for our grandchildren. The two ideas. One idea is we're about to overcome scarcity. And once we overcome scarcity, we will be able to devote ourselves to our higher pursuits. Everyone according to his hobbies, his true interests, the sublime, the private sublime. And we're about to overcome scarcity, and work is a hateful burden, and the less of it, the better. Now, I think those propositions are both false. So I think we're not about to overcome scarcity. Scarcity is endlessly recreated in new forms, and work need not be a hateful burden. Work can be creative and transformative, and we can therefore aspire to freedom in the economy and not just freedom from the economy. I think this is a very fateful question. Which of these views is true? And we're placing bets on one or another being true. But that's the question that you're presenting.
or if also is there like a place in between those two things?
Yes, of course there's spaces between those two things. And of course you would say that in a free economy, in a better economy, there would be more leisure. But there's still this issue of what do we want from the economy? And do we want just to be rid of it as soon as possible? Or do we imagine that it is a sphere, a domain in which we can, by transforming the world, transform ourselves? That is a sphere of liberation. And that is a hope that I'm holding out in this argument. Yes?
I'm curious about this difference between creative, inspirational work that machines can't yet mimic and the sort of repeatable work that they can. Because at least in the current structure of our economy, work that is somewhat repeatable absorbs large numbers of the workforce, whereas inspirational, creative, adaptive work absorbs smaller numbers of the workforce. And already we're seeing trials of machines that can do things like write music, write news articles, do doc review of law.
Yes.
Things we typically think of as human work. And so I'm wondering if, and maybe you'll get to it in your other two planks of the longer term program, if there's, assuming we're not going to get to a post-scarcity, machine-driven productivity, is there some element of your program that would make space for millions of humans in creative endeavor?
Well, I have to say, make one observation about what you just said about the majority. So a very large part of the economy, it consists in personal services of different kinds, which are not formulaic. they can have a formulaic element, but taken as a whole, they're not formulaic. And so I don't think it's quite true that to think of just the non-formulaic as this creative vanguardism. It includes a great deal more, yes.
Sorry, I agree with that to an extent. I think there are things that require personal interaction that humans, consumers, would be not comfortable replacing with machines. But in general, we do see a pattern where the capital savings on payroll is so incentivizing that companies are happy to sacrifice the personal non-formulaic piece of person-to-person services. They're happy to replace cashiers with personal self-checkout machines. They're happy to replace baristas with little windows in major cities where you just have a button in your coffee cup.
Yes.
Even though a barista and a cashier do more than just hand you your items, there's a personal element there that's not formulaic. The capitalists are happy to cut that piece of the equation out, even if it makes the consumer experience worse. And so
No, undoubtedly. That's undoubtedly true. But I wasn't thinking just of the way you purchase objects and human interactions that surround those transactions. But there's a vast part of the economy which consists in personal services, which people render to one another, and which is non-formulaic, even though it doesn't appear as, quote, creative. And so I think it's more complicated. Yes.
For the skilled elements of the workforce who then find that after 20 years of pursuing a skilled career that technology is replaced, even if it's first enhanced and then
Yes.
replaced. In the absence of the kind of education system that you were talking about in the previous lecture already being in place, what is the solution to find meaningful work for those kinds of people?
No, first of all, it does. No, I can't give up that assumption of the kind of education. The transformation, the creation of a knowledge economy for the many depends on the transformation of education. It doesn't depend just on the transformation of education. It also depends on a series of institutional changes and on the accumulation of social capital. But one of the things on which it does depend is a radically different kind of education and the availability of that kind of education to a large part of the population. Without that, it's impossible. So the condition that you refer to is a necessary condition, although not a sufficient one. So now let's say that then there's a second element then in the long-term program. And this is with the nature of free work. So what in general, in the abstract, are the main forms of free work? I would say there are three forms of free labor. Wage labor, economically dependent wage labor, which Karl Marx considered to be the single most salient characteristic of what he called capitalism. That the workers have to sell their labor in order to survive. So in the 19th century, as I said in an earlier class, a view shared by the liberals and the socialists was that economically dependent wage labor was an inferior and transitory form of free work, destined to give way in the course of time to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. So this was the general view. It was not just Karl Marx's view. It was John Stuart Mill's view. It was Abraham Lincoln's view. In his, for example, in his speech to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society before the Civil War, he says, no free man in the possession of his faculties would willingly consent to be a wage laborer for another man. if he could work for himself. And so this was the general view. And it was only at the end of the 19th century that the predominance of wage labor as the primary form of free labor was naturalized. It began to seem natural very recently. It was never regarded as natural before. And so what are the higher forms of free labor? The higher forms of free labor are self-employment and cooperation, and some combination of self-employment and cooperation. So cooperation among self-employed independent proprietors or entrepreneurs. That's the highest form of free labor. Now, what is the problem that the defenders of this idea in the 19th century were never able to solve? The problem is the failure to explain how under a regime in which the dominant form of free labor was self-employment or cooperation among self-employed individuals, how could there ever be aggregation of resources at scale as required in a complex modern economy? That's what they couldn't explain. And it could be explained only by some dynamic of economic accumulation. Some people accumulate those resources. They are then able to buy the labor of the other people. And that's then the basis of production. So the second principle is connected to the first principle. In other words, it seems to me highly unlikely that the evolution of technology in a direction that emphasized the enhancement of labor rather than the replacement of labor would prevail in an economy in which economically dependent wage labor continued to be the predominant form of free work. Because the legal characteristic of wage labor is that the manager, as the representative of capital, has a residual discretionary power to direct labor. The labor relationship is never fully contractualized. There is a residual power of management, of business discretion. So it is like a military organization, and not just like an equal contract. So how is it that under such a system, that direction of technology enhancing labor would ever come to prevail over the direction of technology replacing labor? So the first principle depends on the second. But how could the second principle prevail if it can't solve the problem of the aggregation of resources at scale? So the second principle in turn depends on a third principle. And the third principle is innovation in the property regime. So there must be some form of access to what Marx described as the means of production that does not take the form of absolute, unified, and perpetual property. So, for example, to take the thought experiment to which I have alluded before in the arguments of the course, imagine that many of the productive resources of society are vested in public trusts. And the basic way of using these productive resources is to borrow is to borrow them from these trusts, paying in return a rate of return to the trust. So there's a kind of rotating capital auction, a roving capital auction. The productive resources of society are temporarily auctioned off to the teams of entrepreneurs and technicians who can use them to greatest effect, but who use them only temporarily. That's the thought experiment. And you can imagine any number of intermediate steps between the reality of today and that hypothetical situation. So the long term that I'm describing has these three elements. A transformation in the relation of technology, in which the general direction of technology becomes the enhancement rather than the replacement of labor. The gradual supersession of economically dependent wage labor as the predominant form of free work in favor of self-employment and cooperation, and innovation in the property regime, so that these cooperating self-employed economic agents can have more decentralized or democratized access to the means of production. Now, of course, all of that is very distant, but it's the description of a direction. So if we knew what the direction was, then we could think of what the nearby steps would be to begin moving in that direction. But if we don't know what the direction is, we can't do anything. So no wind helps us if we don't know to what port we're sailing. So we have to have a sense of the direction. Yes. Do you have your hand up? No.
Sorry.
Yeah. So your comments and questions. Yes.
In terms of innovation in the property regime, in theory this makes sense to me, but I'm having trouble thinking of like a concrete way that this would play out. So I'm curious if you have an example or like an ideal system.
Well, first of all, let me say this is not meant to be the whole economy. So the idea here is the market economy should not be fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself. The institutional content of the market order is not self-evident. There is no natural way of organizing a market order. And so we could think that the concept of economic freedom as freedom to recombine the factors of production within a framework of production and exchange that is left constant could be deepened into the conception of freedom also to innovate in the institutional and legal architecture of production and exchange. Now, then we could say that different regimes of property, of private and social property, could coexist experimentally in the same market order. So, for example, the unified absolute property right has a justification. Also, I think this came up in an earlier class. The justification is that it allows someone, it allows the owner to do something that no one else believes in without having to negotiate some set of agreements or to lift the vetoes of some stakeholder. That's the justification of the unified property right. So in the market order, in a free market order, we would always want some such right to continue to exist. But the question is whether it should be the only way in which a market order is organized. And the alternative idea is that the productive resources of society should not be vested in a central state which allocates the resources by some form of discretionary allocation. It should be vested in public but non-state entities, that is, not discretionary allocation. And the capital resources, the productive assets, should be auctioned off to those who are able to assure the trust of the highest rate of return. So under such a system, for example, the basic form of public finance, instead of being taxation, becomes the underlying rate of interest, which is the rate of the return which the trusts charge for the use of the productive assets of society. Now, I think this is a curiosity about orthodox economic thinking. The curiosity is this, that under the orthodox and established ideas, an efficient capital market is this rotating capital auction. So the claim of the efficient capital market is that that's what an efficient capital market already does. It allocates resources to their most productive users, supposedly. And you have only to consider the difference between this idealization and the reality to see what the problem is. So let me go back to something that I said on the very first day of class, the concept of a market order, and its indeterminacy. At the most abstract level, thinking of a market has two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization. That is, the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. In the second dimension, the idea of the market has to do with the degree of control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. Is the control absolute? Is it perpetual? Can he transmit it through inheritance, for example? Or is the control fragmentary, conditional, and temporary? Now, in the orthodox view, these two dimensions are inseparable, and they go naturally together. The dimension of the absolute level of decentralization and the dimension of the absolute level of control. But it's quite obvious that they don't go together, and that in fact there's a contradiction between them. Because one way in which, in principle, you could increase the amount of absolute decentralization is by diminishing or compromising the absoluteness of the control that each of those independent agents has over the resources at his disposal. So you would say, the way in which you'll have more decentralization of access to productive resources is to make the access temporary, or to make it conditional on giving a higher rate of return, which was the example of my thought experiment. So the thought experiment is premised on the idea that these two dimensions of the abstract idea of a market are in potential contradiction with each other and are not naturally and necessarily related. That's the basis of the thought experiment. And then you get to this idea that there's just an empirical question. What is the most effective way of decentralizing access to the means of production so that more people have more access to more markets and more means of production in more ways? That's an empirical question. And you should say, A market then, rather than being fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself, should be realized in a series of alternative institutional forms. Now, that's a discussion that, of course, doesn't exist in the world. That's not how we think. But what I'm saying is that I'm arguing that's how we should think. The question will not be how much market, but which market. And we can imagine the market order organized in a whole series of ways. So one thing we have to do right at the outset of such a discussion is to get rid of the concept of capitalism, because the concept of capitalism is an obstacle. Questions, comments? So I think that in this argument, of course, there's a huge distance between what I call the short term and the long term. The short term is dealing with the problem of precarious or informal labor in these economies in which the vanguard of production has become distant from everything else. The vanguard is a series of exclusive fringes. So we have to master that reality. We can't master it by simply providing the 20th century solutions to 21st century problems. Collective bargaining as a solution to the problems of the insular knowledge economy. And we can't master it by simply giving in to the neoliberal euphemism of flexibility. We have to have a response to this economic reality. But the response is somewhat directionless unless we also have a conception of the long term. And the conception of the long term has to take account of all of those elements that I've just described. So this is a particular instance of the general idea of a shift in the focus of ideological conflict in the world. For 200 years, the ideological contest was modeled in the form of a hydraulic model. More market, less government. More government, less market. Synthesis of government and market. That's social liberalism or social democracy. Now this is a different idea of the ideological conflict, in which the idea is a market order, a democratic politics, and an independent civil society can take alternative institutional forms. And the forms that are now established, especially in the rich North Atlantic countries, represent a subset of a much larger universe of institutional possibilities. The solution to the structural problems of the contemporary societies depends on traveling in other subsets of this universe of institutional possibilities. That's the idea. And that's a completely different idea of what the ideological conflict is. And introduces a totally different set of arguments. Yes.
Would it be okay to ask a question focused on the short-term phase?
Sure.
I'm curious because you described the legal intervention in the employment relation and the sort of collective bargaining, but also the sort of not collective bargaining, but the sort of unionization that you imagine. But also when you were talking to James, you said said, and it sounded really reasonable, that it's much easier to make a shift from corporatist model to non-state controlled unified community.
From the corporatist model to the hybrid model, than from the contractualist model to the hybrid model. Yes.
So I'm wondering, is this the sort of thing where the handful of countries that have some form of corporatist model established or some sort of corporatist model in the political field already are in a lucky sort, or is this the sort of thing that we can see somehow a similar thing eventually taking root in America? Like, is there a gradual option?
No, it seems to me much harder to imagine for the reason that I said.
Me too, and that's sort of why.
Much harder to imagine the transition going in the opposite sequence, because what the great benefit of the corporatist model is it says we will organize society outside the state. Organization is power. So, and we think it's for corporatism in its original inspiration, the purpose of the organization was so that the state could create its own social base. That is the movements, the nationalist populism of Latin America or the fascism of Italy. They would create their own social base and they would control it. That's controlled mass mobilization. But inside of that objectionable idea is something precious. What's precious is this idea that civil society will also be organized. And the organization will not be under the control of the state, but it will be the gift of the law. The law will create a framework and put it at the disposal of civil society so that civil society will be able to organize itself rather than just fighting about whether it should organize itself. The organization will be given to it, and then it will decide what to do with it.
I guess sort of my thinking now that I'm thinking about and that I wonder if you have any insight into is if you were starting with this country's views on unions and this country's union structure or lack thereof as a baseline, is there any way to move towards the sort of short-term and long-term aims you propose in your program from this starting point?
Well, tell me whether I'm mistaken, but I think it's very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely that you could proceed in the direction of universal organization of civil society outside the state. And it's, as I say, it would be a shocking idea, although it's an idea that occurs naturally against a corporatist background. And so organization has to be particular, it has to have particular motivations in particular contexts. But I do think that in this circumstance in which there is exclusion from the vanguard, a motive of organization can then be access to the vanguard. So in the United States now, you could say a version of the fundamental question of political economy in the United States is, why isn't there a knowledge economy in North Dakota? So why is there this extreme concentration of the vanguard geographically, socially, structurally, and the country has to organize then to deepen and disseminate this vanguard. So it seems to me that, and now how is this issue then presented to the unions and to the labor movement? Their characteristic posture is defensive. So their characteristic posture is, let's get a few more years for the Rust Belt, for declining mass production. In other words, let's build ourselves into this niche of our present position in the division of labor, and let's defend it. And against whom will we defend it? We'll defend it against the groups who are closest to us in social space, the temporary workers, the foreign workers, the small business class. They'll all be our enemies. That's the conventional view. And the problem with it, of course, is it has no future, because it's a losing project. The most that it can achieve is to gain a few more years for a form of production that has no future. So what would be the project that has a future? The project that has a future is to convert this declining form of production into a version of the knowledge economy. But in that project of conversion, then, the groups that were regarded as the enemies would have to become the allies. That is, we have to imagine a way in which the small business class, the temporary workers, and so forth would become allies in this project of creating a knowledge economy for the many. So it seems to me that that strategic horizon would then be the much more plausible motive for organization. That's what you would organize for. And so the organization would have a practical political economic direction in mind. That's what I would say. And every programmatic project builds its own base over time. And it doesn't depend just on some antecedent coalition of interests. It creates its own support. Now, of course, it has to create its own support on the basis of a reinterpretation of the way people already think about their interests and identities. They have to be led, they have to be persuaded to understand their identities and interests in a new way. So that's the sphere of action. It seems to me to be crucial. Yes. Yes.
So the idea that the government would have an infrastructure thing that would bid out to those who could use it most efficiently. I think you said that it's not capitalism. And I'm wondering, I don't know, if we look at it like healthcare. So healthcare, Medicare gives out a whole lot of money. And then private entities like doctors and hospitals take that. It's not infrastructure, but it's similarly structured.
Yes.
Sometimes it is infrastructure. Sometimes this machine, we can only have so many in the country. We'll put this machine over here. We won't let anybody else have this machine.
Yes.
And so it's a similar setup. And I think it's a combination of government and private that still incorporates capitalism.
Of course. So, and what's the implication? So what you're saying is that some element of this roving capital auction is already prefigured by features of present reality. I hope so, because no programmatic idea is going to be feasible if it doesn't already have prefigurements in the existing reality. And
It's the expansion of it in a much greater extent.
in a much greater extent, yes. Yes. And as I said, there's the strange thing of my description if you think of my thought experiment of the capital auction, the productive resources of society are in a capital auction, and they're auctioned off temporarily to their most productive uses. If you look at it in one way, that's a utopian idea. It's 1,000 miles away from present reality. If you look at it in another way, that's already the orthodox view of what the capital markets are. They say that that's what they do now, supposedly. For example, when there was the so-called privatization in Russia in the years of the spontaneous privatization, when the productive resources of the Russian people were being bid off by those who later became these oligarchs. Like a very common comment by the economists was, it doesn't matter who initially acquires them, because the assets will ultimately end up in the hands of their most productive users. That's what the capital market is supposed to be. It's supposed to be this auction of capital to its most productive uses. And if you don't use it in the most productive way, you're going to lose those assets to someone else who will be able to use them. So on that view, the capital auction that I described already exists, and it's called capitalism. So it's and this is just the other side of the thought experiment. So the claim that's being made is it's not like that. To make it like what it's supposed to be, we actually have to invent a whole different institutional machinery, including a different kind of property regime.
It's the property more than the capitalism that has to be restructured in a certain sense.
So property, the interest of the property regime is that the property regime is the legal description of the terms on which we have access to the means of production. And so what we're saying is we're going to innovate in those terms so that we will privilege the decentralization of access to the means of production over the absoluteness of the control. We'll allow the control to be temporary and conditional on assuring the highest rate of return, temporary, not perpetually in the hands of the present users, not susceptible to being transmitted by them through inheritance. But we will retain in the market order a section in which there will be the traditional form of property for the reason that I described, so that we can have a bunch of people who can do something in which no one else believes at their own risk. That's the justification of the traditional form of property. But it's not the justification for the universalization of this way of defining our relation to the means of production. It shouldn't be the only way. It should be one way among several ways. So then we imagine the market order contains within itself alternative regimes of private law, of property and contract, and those different property and contract regimes coexist experimentally. So we see what happens. Transforming the ideological dogma into a subject for institutional and legal experimentation and empiricism.
So it's significantly different than when some social democratic countries in Western Europe allowed national banks to exist, that they control.
Yeah, so the spirit of social democracy, remember, going back then to the beginning of the argument, the spirit of social democracy was the market order is a tremendous motor for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it generates inequalities. And so we have to correct them through corrective redistribution, which is the subject of social democracy and of the theories of justice and so forth. And here we're shifting the ground. We're saying the role is, the idea is not to humanize the existing market order. The idea is to reinvent the market order. as the Americans did in the first half of the 19th century. I gave the example of agriculture and of finance. They reinvented the agricultural market. They reinvented the financial market. They didn't just regulate it. They didn't just attenuate its inequalities through retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer. So I think this is so the terms of the social democratic compromise would have to be reopened. And it's reopened in favor of a set of institutional experiments in the form of the market order, in the form of democracy, and in the organization of civil society. So, and my basic claim is that none of the fundamental or structural problems of the contemporary societies can be solved or even addressed unless we reopen the terms of that mid-20th century social democratic compromise. So the main line of ideological evolution in the contemporary Western societies has been to liberalize classical social democracy. So that's the dominant transatlantic project now. Combine the social protection of the Europeans with the economic flexibility of the Americans within the barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional order. I'm saying that's not good enough. It's not good enough to overcome the insularity of the knowledge economy. It's not good enough to create a new basis of social cohesion. It's not good enough to create a form of political life that doesn't need war and economic ruin as the condition for structural change. So in order to do all of those things, we have to change the structure, meaning the institutional arrangements of the market, of democratic politics, and of independent civil society. But now we have a problem. The problem is that when we think of structural change, we think of it through the Marxist lens. There's a system, capitalism, or something else. And if we don't have that system, we have another system. So structural change must mean some big systemic change. And I'm saying, if we think about structural change in that way, none of these problems can be solved. So it's necessary to reject this idea of structural change and to understand that structural change, when it exists, is by its nature almost always fragmentary. And it can become even revolutionary in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction under a certain conception. So that's the complicated set of intellectual innovations that's involved in this shifting of the ground, in this reinterpretation of the circumstance. So the important thing is for this idea to be understood. There are many reasons to dispute it. I'm not trying to persuade you, but I just want to make it clear. This is the claim. So, and the claim can be tested. So, if, for example, this question of the insular knowledge economy, how do we overcome the insularity of the knowledge economy? And the high-tech elite in the United States typically affirms education, not just as a necessary element, but as the only element. So they look around and say, why isn't the rest of the country like us? Well, they're not like us because they don't have the right ideas or something. And that's certainly a part of the problem, but it's far from being the whole problem. Because the overcoming of the insularity of the knowledge economy would require a complicated and combined set of institutional and legal changes, which we discussed before last week. And those are changes in the legal and institutional architecture of the market. So that's what social democracy in the mid-20th century abandoned. It said, we're not going to discuss the basic architecture of the market order because that means replacing capitalism by socialism. We're not going to discuss things like that. What we're going to do is to make the existing world fairer, more efficient, more humane, and thus the characteristic posture of the contemporary progressives, which is to put a human face on the project of their adversaries. So what is the project of the contemporary progressives? It's the conservative project with a humanizing discount. And that's what they represent. And I'm saying there's no future in that. The structural problems require structural solutions. And in politics, the force that represents the cause of energy, of construction, of innovation, commands the agenda. Not the force that comes later and says, you've done something, but it's brutal. I'm going to humanize it. That's a losing position. Then that's a losing position in history. Karl Marx thought it was a losing position. He thought that there was the development of the forces of production that would determine everything. So his theoretical assumptions, I think, are many of them are false. But his fundamental insight that energy creation is everything, and transformation above piety is the motto of the progressives. Yes?
So I understand part of it is a thought experiment, and I certainly understand America's not the whole world. But I'm really trying to see if we were to apply this, try to apply it to America, I hope to.
Yes.
If that were the case, when people are so much against government control, distrustful of the government, how would one...
This isn't about government. I think that's you see, this is part of the rhetorical problem. If I suggest to you, if I'm debating with you or say with Larry Summers or someone, and I say, here's the alternative. Here's the alternative market order. He said, well, that's statism. But it's because in their minds, what they mean by the market is the present market. So, of course, any other market is an invention, a collective invention. It has to take a legal form. That doesn't mean that it's the instrument of the state. So this is an elementary confusion between the idea of statism and the idea that the structures of society have to take a legal form. They have to be the creation of the law. But the law isn't the state. And so we are right here in this class, and in last week, we've been discussing alternative forms of the market order. So next week, for example, I'm going to discuss the relation of finance to the real economy, the third theme of a progressive political economy. And so that's another example. That's not about the state. So in the current economy, finance basically serves itself rather than serving the productive agenda of society. So the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What's the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It's supposed to serve the productive agenda of society. In fact, it has an oblique or episodic relation to production. Why? So this isn't natural. It's the result of certain institutional arrangements. And if we replace them by other arrangements, we're not increasing the power of the state vis-a-vis something else. We're transforming the nature of the market. In that case, the nature of the capital market. Yes?
I think that's a true and important distinction, but I think there's something at the heart of what you were saying, sorry, I just get you, that, because we were talking about the idea of making a progressive project viable against the objection that Americans have to beta. And I think it's true that projects make their own base over time, but I also think it's true that American citizens, politicians, and definitely the capitalists, don't draw a distinction between redesigning the market and putting it under the active control of state entities, or just rather collectively and through the instrument of law, redesigning the institutions and market and then allowing it to run free. But we Americans see both of those things as manifesting as interference by the government to equal degree, even though they're not.
Well, okay. But where does the market order come from? It comes from something. It's not self-defined.